In the early hours of July 20, 1971, a 911 call went out of Burlington, Vermont when a lady contacted the police to report the murder of her roommate, Rita Curran. It appeared that the lady who had been at work a day before, had returned to see Rita Curran in the pool of her own blood on the bed they both shared. When the police arrived, they discovered that someone had broken into the lady's apartment and had beaten, sexually assaulted and strangled Rita Curran to death. They also found evidence that Rita Curran had strongly resisted her attacker, putting up a fight. The question of who killed Rita Curran bugged her family and the Burlington Police Department for years, but the killer remained a mystery for decades despite the police looking into hundreds of tips. However, 52 years later, Rita Curran's killer was eventually identified. Hello and welcome to Inside Crimes. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more crime cases. Rita Curran was born on the 21st of June 1947 in Brooklyn, Kings County, New York, to Thomas and Mary Curran. She was described as a kind, generous and beautiful person who wouldn't do anyone any harm. When Rita Curran turned 24 years old, in the summer of 1971, she decided to move out of her parents' home for the first time, into a shared apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont with 3 other roommates whom she did not know well. At the time, she was a second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School and had started graduate courses at the University of Vermont, while she worked during the summer break as a maid at a local motel. Unfortunately, just 2 weeks after she left her family's house, she was murdered in her apartment in Burlington, Vermont. According to police report, she seemed ready for bed the night she was attacked as she was found dead with curlers in her hair. Many people know Burlington to be a small and friendly city, but when Rita Curran was killed, it caused ripples of fear in the city because at that time, many Burlington residents left their front doors unlocked. This could explain why Rita Curran's apartment door might not be locked at the time of her murder, since the police did not discover any visible force used on the entrance door. During the investigation, police officers collected evidence from the crime scene that included a single cigarette found near Rita Curran's arm, which was believed the killer left to burn out. They also interviewed Rita Curran's neighbors and investigated hundreds of tips. Among the neighbors interrogated were a newly wedded couple, Williams and Michelle Derus, who lived in an apartment 2 floors above Rita Curran's at the time of her murder. They, however, told investigators that they had been together all night and didn't hear or see anything. The police had a list of 13 suspects, in which Ted Bundy was one of them. It appeared that the location of the local motel where Rita Curran worked was adjacent to serial killer Ted Bundy's birthplace, the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. Rita Curran's murder and crime scene was similar to how Ted Bundy attacked his victims, and this led retired FBI agent John Bassett to propose him as a suspect at the time. In order to find closure and to ask if truly he killed Rita Curran, Mary Campbell Curran, Rita Curran's sister, wrote a letter to Florida's death row where Ted Bundy was being held. In response, the FBI told her that Ted Bundy had refused to confirm or deny his involvement in Curran's death, and there was no evidence that firmly placed him in Burlington on that date of the murder. However, Detective Robert D. Keppel interviewed Ted Bundy, who later told him that he had murdered a young woman in 1971 in Burlington when he was there to obtain information about his birth, but, on January 22, 1989, the eve of his execution, Ted Bundy denied his involvement in Rita Curran's case to FBI Special Agent William Hagmeyer. Having exhausted all leads, and without an improved DNA technology to pinpoint a suspect, the case went cold for over 4 decades. According to Burlington's acting police chief, John Murad, the department never stopped seeking justice for Rita Curran's family. In 2014, the Burlington's police department sent all the evidence collected at the crime scene, including the cigarette, to a forensic lab in New York City for DNA testing. Though the tests compiled a DNA profile of the person who had smoked the cigarette, it didn't match any DNA in databases compiled by law enforcement agencies across the country. That meant the person with the DNA on the cigarette butt likely never had genetic material entered into the database, possibly because the person didn't have a felony conviction. The DNA testing also didn't match the known DNA of any of the police's 13 main suspects. However, in 2019, Detective Lieutenant James Trieb decided to try a new approach to the case. Instead of having a single detective work on the case alone, per the usual department strategy, Lieutenant Trieb decided to bring in a new team of detectives and expert technicians who discussed and reviewed the Rita Curran's case. This team treated the case as if it had just been committed. They began retesting evidence by sending the cigarette for DNA analysis again, but, this time, they used genetic genealogy, which is a process that uses DNA databases for genealogy research to identify possible family members of the person whose DNA is unmatched. After the DNA analysis, the genetic genealogy expert concluded that the cigarette DNA had strong connections to relatives of William Derus, the man who lived 2 floors above Rita Curran's apartment in 1971, who had been questioned alongside his wife by detectives and claimed to have been in his home during the time of the murder. The investigators then searched and found a living half-brother of William's, Derus, who willingly provided a DNA sample. After the test, it was however concluded that the cigarette DNA belonged to William's, Derus. In 2022, more evidence at the crime scene, including Rita Curran's ripped housecoat, were sent to a crime lab in Florida where they performed new DNA extracting techniques. Before then, the detectives had sent the genetic evidence from the cigarette to a genealogy company to see if a bigger database of DNA could help them pinpoint the killer. The scientist and genealogy expert was able to match the DNA from the cigarette to William Derus within hours of research through genealogical records and public records. Also, finally, the DNA left on Rita Curran's ripped housecoat also matched the DNA on the cigarette butt. The investigators later discovered that William Derus died at age 46 in 1986 at a San Francisco hotel from a drug overdose. Shortly after Rita Curran's murder, he and his wife left Vermont and got divorced. In an interview with the police, William Derus' ex-wife, Michelle, who had moved to Eugene, Oregon, and had changed her name, told investigators she had lied in 1971 about her husband being with her all night in their apartment. It was established that William Derus had gotten into an argument with his wife on the evening of July 19, 1971, and had gone out for a walk to supposedly cool off. He returned later that night and told his wife the next morning to tell the police investigating Rita Curran's death that he had never left their apartment, warning her that his past criminal record might unfairly make him a suspect in her death. Detective Thomas Chanette, who interviewed Michelle, said he didn't believe she knew William Derus had killed Curran, but was protecting him because they were newly married and obviously in love and he had a criminal record. After their divorce, William Derus moved to Thailand and became a monk. He then came back to San Francisco, United States in 1974, where he met his second wife, Sarah Hepting. Sarah Hepting said in an interview with Burlington police that William Derus had a penchant for sudden outbursts of violence. She said there were 2 instances where he had been extremely violent around her. One of which was when they both were having a conversation with a female friend and he had taken a pocket knife and stabbed the woman in her abdomen for no reason whatsoever. He was arrested, but the woman did not press charges. Derus later told Hepting that he thought it was her he stabbed. Sarah Hepting said the second instance of Derus' violence was when he suddenly started to strangle her for no reason, when they were having dinner. She said that was the last straw and the reason she left him. After Rita Curran's case was declared solved, even though her parents unfortunately died without knowing her killer, her living family and friends remembered her and were glad that they finally have closure. Jim Rabar, Rita Curran's second-grade student, remembered her as a kind and beautiful person. He said, "We actually did a play the year that I had her. I forgot what the play was about, but I was a dancing clown holding a teddy bear. She told me that I could keep the teddy bear, and I still have the teddy bear, I just can't find it." Her sister, Mary Curran Campbell, said, "We now have 2 generations in our family who never knew her." Tom Curran, her brother, said, "I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. I pray to my parents, and I pray to Rita. Closing the case, Lieutenant Trabe said, "We're all confident that William Derus is responsible for the aggravated murder of Rita Curran, but because he died in a hotel room of a drug overdose, he will not be held accountable for his actions, but this case will be closed." Around 6:30 a.m., on January 18 of 1981 in Camarillo, California, about 50 miles from Los Angeles, two newspaper delivery boys discovered the naked body of 20-year-old Rachel Zendejas, an Oxnard college student and a single mom of two who had recently gone through a divorce. She was murdered in an apartment complex's carport just across the street from her apartment in 700 block of Mobile Avenue, which she shared with her brother and two daughters, who were 1 and 2 years old at the time of her murder. The police got to the crime scene and retrieved evidence. During the investigation, detectives learned that Rachel Zendejas had gone out the evening before her murder to hire a couple of babysitters to stay with her girls. She then went out that evening and came back home the following morning, after which she dropped off the babysitters. Her killer was believed to have attacked her as she got out of her vehicle after returning home from dropping off the babysitters. Her case was investigated for several years until all leads were exhausted and the case eventually became cold. However, before the end of the year, in the early hours of December 12, 1981, a neighbor called the police to report a fire outbreak at an apartment in Oxnard. Members of the Oxnard Fire Department rushed to the scene and extinguished the fire. When done, they discovered the naked body of 21-year-old Lisa Gandek in the bathtub of the apartment. Her killer had raped her, strangled her, and then set the apartment on fire. Her neighbors heard screams but did not call 911 until they smelled smoke. Lisa Gandek was a retail worker living in Oxnard, about 10 miles west of Camarillo, and she had attended a club at the Port Hueneme Naval Base on the night of December 11, 1981. She went to a disco with her friends, after which her friends later dropped her off at her home at around 1:30 a.m. the following day. She was discovered dead in her bathtub, and her killer was unknown for decades. Lisa Gandek was said to have been on a visit to Oxnard from Connecticut for a planned 2-week trip to visit a friend in the U.S. Navy. However, she ultimately decided to move to Oxnard months before she was murdered. She had made a promise to her loved ones to spend the Christmas with them. In her words, she said, "Mom, I'll be home for Christmas." Lisa Gandek had moved in with a childhood best friend and got a job at a teen clothing store in the Esplanade Shopping Center in Oxnard. Being new to the area didn't stop her from quickly making new friends. According to her roommate, Lisa Gandek was a kind person and beautiful in and out. In her words, she said, "If Lisa had $1, she would split it with you." Rachel Zendejas and Lisa Gandek cases were separately investigated from each other until in 2002, when the suspect's DNA from Rachel Zendejas' crime scene was sent to the FBI's Combined DNA Index system. A search was conducted on the criminal database for felons in order to pinpoint the killer, but it yielded no results. However, 23 years after the murder, in 2004, the investigators working on Lisa Gandek's case utilized DNA testing and later informed the Ventura County Sheriff's Office that they had linked both Rachel Zendejas and Lisa Gandek's homicides cases to a single suspect. The DNA, however, did not return any results that could put a face to the suspect, and the case went cold again. Another stunning connection about both women going to a nightclub called Huntington in the hours before their deaths was established. The club, now closed, was a hot spot across from the Esplanade Mall. In December 2019, Ventura County's Cold Case Unit took over the cases again and applied genetic genealogy, an advanced DNA testing that is used to identify possible relatives to the suspects. The investigation then provided new leads, and further DNA testing confirmed that Tony Garcia was the suspect in both homicides. Tony Garcia resided in Oxnard at the time of his arrest in February 7, 2023. He had been right under the noses of the detectives for over 4 decades. He was born in Roswell, New Mexico, but was enlisted in the U.S. Navy and stationed at Point Mugu near Oxnard. Tony Garcia was however discharged from service in 1980 but remained in Oxnard, where he became a karate student and instructor for many years. He was working as a carpenter at the time of his arrest. It is not known if Tony Garcia knew any of his victims. Tony Garcia was charged with 2 counts of murder, plus special allegations of committing murder while engaged in a rape and committing murder while engaged in a kidnapping. At his first appearance in court, he was ordered to be held without bail. Following Tony Garcia's arrest, Rachel Zendejas' brother, Roy Rodriguez said, "I am alive for this. It is my purpose to get this thing solved for Rachel."